According to the BBC on February 21, 2024, the following news is reported. It has been 2 years since the war in Ukraine broke out, but there is no sign of an end anytime soon. In a nutshell, neither Ukraine nor Russia, nor both major allies, have found a basis for a peace agreement. Ukraine is in a position that the border between the two countries should be restored in a state recognized by the international community and that the Russian military should withdraw from its territory, while Russia insists that Ukraine is not a proper country and will continue to push its forces until the goal of this war is achieved. If so, we looked at what is happening now and the direction of this war going forward, which is the dominant situation. Fierce fighting continues throughout this winter, resulting in numerous casualties on both sides. The 1,000 kilometers front has barely changed its shape since fall 2022. Within a few months of the invasion, 2 years before Russia launched an all-out war, Ukraine pushed Russian forces out of the northern region and around its capital, Kyiv. And by the end of that year, it had regained large swaths of territory in the east and south. Now, however, the Russian military has firmly fortified the occupied area, and the Ukrainian side is complaining of a depletion of ammunition. Many believe the current military stalemate has been reached, including the recently dismissed Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian Forces Valery Zaluzhny and several pro-government Russian military bloggers. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military withdrew from Avdiivka in the eastern Donetsk region, where it had been fighting for a long time in mid-month. Russia responded by calling it a major victory. Avdiivka is a strategic location and could pave the way for a deeper invasion. Ukrainian authorities described the move as a measure to protect the lives of soldiers, but did not hide the fact that it was pushed back from the size and firepower of its troops. In fact, it was the biggest victory for the Russian military since the occupation of Bakhmut in Donetsk in May last year. But Avdiivka is just 20 kilometers northwest of Donetsk, a Ukrainian city that has been occupied by Russia since 2014. So the news that it has barely advanced this much seems far from its initial ambition to capture the capital, Kyiv. Within 3 days, that Russian authorities touted and spread by military bloggers in February 2022. Russia currently occupies about 18% of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which Russia annexed in March 2014. And most of the eastern Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which have since been controlled by Russia. Is it possible to continue to provide support in the West? According to the Kiel World Economic Research Institute, Ukraine's allies have provided huge amounts of military, financial and humanitarian aid for the past 2 years through January. First of all, the European Union provided about $92 billion and the US provided about $73 billion. Western supplied tanks, air defenses, and long-range artillery have been of great help to Ukraine so far. But aid has been dwindling in recent months, with debate over how long it can support Ukraine. For example, a new $60 billion support plan has been prepared in the United States, but it has not been passed by Congress due to domestic political debates. In addition, there are voices of concern that U.S. support for Ukraine could be cut off if Donald Trump wins the White House again. In the November presidential election, after several rounds of discussions and negotiations, a $54 billion support plan was passed this month in the EU. In particular, negotiations with Hungary were difficult. Prime Minister Orbán Viktor is close to Putin and openly opposes supporting Ukraine. In addition, the EU has decided to provide 1 million shells to Ukraine by the end of March this year, but only about half of that seems to be possible. Meanwhile, Belarus, which borders both Russia and Ukraine, is a country that supports Russia. Belarus has also granted permission for Russian forces to use their territory and airspace to approach Ukraine. The US and EU also claim Iran is supplying Russia with Shahid drones. However, Iran says it only provided Russia with a small number of Shahids before the war. UAVs have been proven to be an effective means to strike targets in Ukraine. Both sides need UAVs as they can avoid air defense. Sanctions against Russia have not been as effective as Western countries have expected. Russia is still selling oil and receiving parts for the military industry. China is known to be providing no weapons to either side. In fact, China appears to be diplomatically cautious about the war. Of course, despite continuing to buy Russian oil along with India, it does not criticize Russia's invasion and does not support Russia militarily. Meanwhile, both Russia and Ukraine are making great efforts to win support from developing countries, including several visits to Africa and Latin America. Will there be a change in Putin's goals? It is already widely known that Russian President Vladimir Putin still wants Ukraine as a whole. In a recent interview with U.S. talk show host Tucker Carlson, Putin once again expressed his distorted view of history and his thoughts about the war. Without providing any solid evidence, Putin has consistently maintained that Ukraine's civilians, especially those in the eastern Donbass region, need Russian protection. Before the outbreak of the war, President Putin once wrote a lengthy article saying he did not recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state, describing Russia and Ukraine as one people. In December last year, President Putin said that his goals for the war, which Russia calls its special military operation, have not changed, including Ukraine's binatization. It is a groundless claim that far-right forces are influencing Ukraine. In addition, he is constantly opposed to NATO's expansion of influence, saying that he seeks demilitarization and neutralization of Ukraine. Ukraine has never joined any military alliance as an independent country. Ukraine is politically aiming to join the EU, and negotiations with NATO were underway to become closer. And it seems that it is one step closer to joining the EU and NATO than it was at the beginning of the war. By achieving these goals, Ukraine seeks to strengthen its national status, while also being protected from getting caught up in Russia's geopolitical work to restore any form of former Soviet territory. Will this war ever end? Many experts say a long-term war, with neither side showing signs of surrendering, and Putin likely to remain in power within Russia. The global security think tank Globsec evaluated possible previous scenarios by combining the opinions of dozens of experts. The most likely scenario is that the war of attrition will continue after next year, causing major casualties on both sides. While Ukraine continues to rely on arms supplies from its allies, the second most likely scenario is that Russia is trying to escalate tensions in the international community, escalating conflicts in other parts of the world, including the Middle East, China, Taiwan, and the Balkans. In addition, two other scenarios with similar feasibility include Ukraine making some military progress, but failing to reach an agreement for an end to the war, reducing support from allies, and pressuring allies to negotiate with Ukraine. But uncertainty still lingers over the potential impact of the U.S. presidential election and how the conflict unfolding elsewhere, especially the Israel-Hamas conflict, will affect it. Could this war spread to other regions? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out that if Ukraine's artificial weapon shortage persists in the middle of this month, it would be helping Russia. President Zelensky, who attended the Munich Security Council (MSC), warned that Putin would bring disaster to more countries in the coming years if the West did not confront him. The UK's Royal Joint Military Research Institute, RUSI, a defence think tank, explained that Russia has successfully converted its economy and defence industry to fit large-scale military production and is already preparing for a long-term war. He pointed out that Europe is not keeping up with this pace. Poland's foreign minister also raised similar concerns. European countries have recently expressed concern that Russia could attack NATO members within the next decade, with the German foreign minister and Estonian intelligence also warning. As a result, NATO and the EU must not only increase their military capabilities, but also strengthen their future plans, such as preparing to live in a very different world.
So far, it was a miscellaneous jabdiguri that told all the news in the world. Subscribe and like is love.